And so I'm going to move us then to post the elections. So we have this interim constitution established, and the first universal democratic elections on 27th of April 1994. Um, and then you become part of the Gauteng legislature, but then very quickly you are offered, are asked to apply for the role of executive director of the Constitutional Assembly, which which you then become. And what did this role entail?
In effect, currently in Parliament, you have a post called a Secretary of Parliament, the person who manages Parliament. The Executive Director of the Constitutional Assembly was really the mirror image of that, in the sense that we were dealing with the same grouping of people who were in Parliament, but in a different structure called the Constitutional Assembly, because there was Parliament made up of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces as one structure, but both those structures, the people from both those structures also served in their capacity in the Constitutional Assembly when they sat as a Constitutional Assembly. So while for Parliament you had a Secretary of Parliament, the opposite number for the Constitutional Assembly was the Executive Director. So my responsibility was to manage uh, all the activities of the Constitutional Assembly, which meant both houses of Parliament sitting together and organizing them into the structures that would enable them to effectively undertake their negotiations. That effectively got morphed and changed by one of the early decisions, which then changed the course of history in constitution making, not only in South Africa, but in the world, was a decision in one of the early meetings of the Constitutional Assembly to ensure that the Constitution was adopted after consulting the public. So we were then instructed not only to manage a process of negotiations, but also manage a process of consultations that would take place with the broader public, and therefore a public participation program which would then enrich or then flow into the negotiations process. So, in effect, was managing the Constitutional Assembly, whether it be in its negotiations, whether it be in its public participation, and of course, all the logistic and administrative responsibilities that went with it.
Although I believe you managed to execute this role with an incredible amount of aplomb, there was one moment that stood out to me in which there was a little bit of awkwardness. So can you please take me through what happened at your first meeting of the Constitutional Committee?
Yeah, after, towards, I think it would have been about September 1994, September, October, if not a little later. Uh, the Constitutional Assembly, we put together an administrative structure to support the Constitutional Assembly. We developed a program. We developed a program of activities for the Constitutional Assembly, identified structures that the Constitutional Assembly would operate in, being theme committees and so on, and then established a full-fledged plan, which would then plot out how the constitution would be negotiated. And my responsibility was to present that plan, which we had worked on for a couple of months, come back to the Constitutional Committee to get it approved. And of course, technology being what it was at that point in time, we didn't have our overhead project. We didn't have normal projectors where we would deal with PowerPoint slides, and PowerPoint slides were not as effective as it is today. So the technology was quite backdated, outdated, or rather in its infant stage, and involved a number of different pieces of equipment with an overhead projector, and it would allow me to then project slides explaining really the whole plan. And without, of course, my nervousness with it all led to me tripping over the many cables that were there to put all of this equipment together. And everything, of course, came crashing down. Uh, I think it was pure luck that I wasn't given any hard time by it. In fact, the entire Constitutional Committee became quite sympathetic to my challenge that I was facing, gave me an opportunity, and then offered me the opportunity to then present the presentation orally without the benefit of having slides. Uh, but I think they all felt quite sorry for me. And feeling sorry for me made it easier for them to accept the plan and the program that I had. And they went with it. And I built up a very good relationship after that with most members of the Constitutional Assembly, irrespective of which political party they belong to. We built up a relationship of respect and enjoyed a working relationship that allowed us to get work done, even in the most difficult of times. So it was a good start, a difficult start to a very good process.
You were also insistent in this role in having active public participation, especially after the agreement that this is what you needed. And so, how did you go about engaging the public in the constitution making process, which is typically quite a dry, very kind of legal and political process? And why was this so important to you?
Bear in mind, until then in history, no country had undertaken a constitution making process or review process other than it being done in exclusive rooms, usually with only males, smoke filled rooms, and the elite of the elite. And that's how constitutions were generally negotiated. We broke that mold. We broke that mold by involving ordinary people. Ordinary people, we devised, I thought was even now, was somewhat clever ways, even though we didn't have the technology of social media, which would have been really effective. But we created ways in which to involve people through a process of first of educating the public of what the process was, so people understood the process and what the issues were. And thirdly, we did so in a way in which involved all the political parties, so nobody felt that what the messages that we were conveying were messages that were politically biased or favoring one party or another. So we did so in quite an effective way. We educated the public, but then got them to get involved. And initially, it was by way of petitions, submissions, and engagement. And then later, also, it became involved. It grew into actual meetings where we would engage with civil society structures and structures of the community throughout the country. So we developed a community liaison program. And in this community liaison program, it would allow us to take politicians from the Constitutional Assembly into a community and provide a report in a town hall setup where we would give a report of what the developments were taking place in the Constitution and then inviting them to prepare or present ideas from the floor, and people would then be offered an opportunity to give their opinions and views on different things. This gave a unique opportunity to politicians, even those politicians who were previously involved in a parliament, mainly the white parties, gave them an opportunity to engage in public participation, which never was done before. So it offered everybody that opportunity. And the unique thing was that taking multi party groupings into all communities, irrespective of what political affiliation or alignment those communities were, and gave them an opportunity to hear and sense and feel what people wanted and what their thoughts were. In a sense, it humbled people. It humbled people because it gave people an understanding that constitutions were about people and their experiences and their lives, and it wasn't that those matters that purely affected the intellectuals who could deal with the academics and so on, and that constitutions was about the people and had to be the people had to be party to it and involved in it. And so that experience essentially changed the way in which the world looked at constitutions, whether it be review or making of new constitutions, and even facilitation of conflicts, which would result in legal agreements in many parts of the world. So, fascinating experience. Clearly, one of the best experiences ever had as working both as a lawyer, but also as a political person, but also in terms of experience. We charted new territory. We were able to do so successfully, and as yeah, a source of great and immense pride to all of the people in the team, which for me is what really made it. We had a, we had a very small team of people that was responsible for this. And without the team that I had, it would not have been possible to actually undertake the grandiose program that we had. So we were very fortunate. We had a good team, a team that was focused with a clear vision. They knew what they needed to do, and they were able to execute it. So I'm very grateful for that.
How do you think that the public participation impacted the final constitution?
Very big, very big. There's a couple of ways in which it literally crept into the constitution. So I remember the debates very clearly on the making processes in Parliament, and how Parliament went about preparing legislation for approval. And I remember the debates and the discussions of politicians saying that it is a critical requirement that Parliament must henceforth only prepare and approve legislation that had the opportunity of public participation and engagement. And we've seen the effect and the benefit of that, because we've seen a number of pieces of legislation in the last number of years being taken to the Constitutional Court only because there wasn't enough public participation on it. So public support for legislation then became an embedded aspect for the future, and will ever be so, only because of the experience of the constitution making. So yes, it had a dramatic impact. The way in which Parliament operated, we changed the way in which Parliament operated effectively, and took out the elitism and made it much more structured, organized, in a better sense of participation. So committees of parliament would effectively, and were structured in a way in which to ensure that even minority parties would be able to participate in committees of parliament. So where minority parties did not have enough people to be present in all of the different committees of parliament, they now were offered better opportunities. And that's the influence of the constitution making process itself, as well as a public participation program. So we're very grateful for that. And so in a sense, there's a bit of a signature and a footprint of our experience in the constitution, and I'm confident that it will uh, not be diminished. In fact, it will grow, but it's also grown in other constitutions and in other countries. And I think that's something that's worth noting.